today, we're joined by Roger Kline, who will be familiar to many of you. But just a little bit of a quick introduction. So Roger's Research Fellow at Middlesex University Business School. As people will be aware, he's authored a number of different reports on race equality in the NHS and designed the Workforce Race Equality Standard. He was Joint National Director of the WRES team between 2015 and 2017. He's been the author of a range of outputs, books, journal articles, blogs, etc., particularly more recently regarding disciplinary action in the context of patient safety being fair in 2019, and worked with a good friend of mine, Duncan Lewis, on bullying in the NHS, and produced one of the most authoritative estimates of the cost of workplace bullying in the NHS, which I know has had a lot of impact since its publication a couple of years ago. Roger's an advisor to the developing NHS National HR Strategy, and I think that's something we're going to be touching on today. And previously was a trade union official in the dim and distant past. So that's Roger. Good morning, Roger. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you. Not going to give me too hard a time, are you?
I hope not. I hope not. I hope not. What we would like, all the delegates here today, if we're going to be talking for about 30 minutes or so. We're going to have some time for discussion and debate before the end of the session. If there's comments and questions you'd like to put in the chat, my colleague Daria is going to be monitoring that, and we'll try and feed that into the discussion as we go along. So please feel free. The reason why we do this in meeting format is so that people can see each other and we can actually create a bit of a vibe and have a bit of discussion. So please challenge, disagree, be controversial. I know Roger's going to be, so that's going to fit well. Okay, so just to start, a bit of a sort of just a general opener. One of the key things for me, I've done a bit of research in the NHS now, when obviously I've not been as involved as Roger. And one of the things that struck me is that although the NHS has always traditionally had a lot of challenges, is that in the area that I'm particularly interested in, which is the managing workplace conflict, it's also been a sort of a key area of innovation as well. So it's done some really interesting things. And I just wonder if we could just go back and Roger, could you talk a little bit about where the impetus for change in the NHS in relation to some of these issues came from, and particularly the sort of things that you've been involved in? What was the sort of impetus for that? Where did that come from?
I think there's a sort of general theme, and then there's some specific ones. So I think the Francis report was a significant shock to the system, because what it highlighted was, I forget the exact wording, but basically the business of trust was taking precedent over the business of patience. David Nicholson, I think, at some point framed it in that way. So that the Francis report led to much greater emphasis on what's happening to patients. What it didn't do was to then move it to the next thing, that if you really want to look after the business of patients, you also have to look after staff. So I think from that, there's a body of work, you'll be familiar with it. So some of the work of Michael West, Amy Edwards's stuff on psychological safety, some of the stuff from Don Berwick, etc., which said we should be treating staff primarily as an asset, not as a cost. And then we have a growing body of research that says some of the things that says. So what sort of leadership behaviors, what sort of interventions are more likely to be able to enable staff to be looked after, cared for, supported, that are more likely in turn to improve staff health and well-being, improve organizational effectiveness, and impact on patient care and safety. And there's now, as you know, a very substantial body of research, much of it the last 20 years in this country. But I think that's been quite persuasive in saying this is not just about niceness, it's about actually not just social justice, but it's about it'll make better organizations. So I think Francis started the discussion that it's got to be about more than money. I think there's been a growing awareness in the last few years that the research, I think its research has had an impact. And then we have leaders who've said, you know what, this is what I've always tried to do. And I can give some lovely examples, but it's those leaders that they walk around and they listen and they talk to the porter, not just to the senior managers. They know who works in their organization. They kind of pay attention. So I think that's become more accepted as that's what good leadership looks like. I have to say there's still a few corporate psychopaths around, but I think there's been a shift there, and I think that reflects on some of the other functions, including to some degree HR.
We'll pick up on HR in a second, but I just wondered, I'm really interested to how far do you think that's come? So you talked about sort of, you know, certainly improvements in the quality of leadership and sort of potentially, you know, we've heard about moves towards more compassionate, inclusive approaches. How widespread do you think that is? Are we talking about islands, or are there islands of poor practice and generally the good stuff is more widespread? How far do you think the NHS has come in relation to getting the right type of leadership in to create more positive workplaces?
I think it's still a minority, but I think it's a significantly larger minority than it was. It's really not helped by the fact that, you know, we're 100,000 staff short at a time of workload pressures. COVID actually had a double kind of impact. It was kind of immense sort of stress test for the system, which brought out some of the best in people, but it also brought out some of the kind of worst. And it just exposed the kind of racialized nature of the workforce, and some of the behaviors that came through were an exaggerated version of what's happened. So I think there is, I mean, I won't name the trust, but, you know, a very, very large trust. The chief exec, two chief execs from very large trust, out of the blue, rang me up and said, you know, can we have a conversation about that? And I said, you do know who I am, because you might not like what I'm going to say. And they said, well, that's why we're on the phone. So I think there is movement. I think part of the problem now is that COVID got people thinking much more about why, you know, compassionate, inclusive, enabling leadership is more important. But I think a lot of people just don't know how to do it. I mean, particularly when you drill down to specific issues like race discrimination or whistleblowing. What is it we need to do? And I think we need much more thought about the how, not just the why. And we don't just need stuff coming down. I mean, I'm doing a little bit of work with NHS improvement, and there are actually some very good people there, including around the HR program. But that, you know, there needs to get that balance right between motivating people and telling people what to do. Because if you get that wrong, it's just more command and control, and it won't work.
Yeah, I think something that came out a little while ago, I did a bit of research with the HPMA, and that the fear that actually command and control would sort of spill over from the pandemic into normal working was something that strongly came through that. In terms of the how, so you talked about the how, what do you think are some of the main components? I know that's a really big question, but is there anything you can pick out in terms of, you know, what those sorts of priorities need to be going forward, particularly given the sorts of pressures that everybody in the NHS is under at the moment? So
there are probably two or three things. The first thing is leaders need to know themselves better. But, you know, if I take an example and then I generalize from that, maybe, Richard. So if you take recruitment and career progression, the last set of data shows that we've made no progress in the last 12 months whatsoever, despite it allegedly being a priority. In fact, no progress in the last 2 years. A little bit of progress at the top, but overall the data shows it's not happening. I think a lot more leaders than before, as a result of COVID and Black Lives Matters, know they need to do something better, but they don't know how. And if the kind of the current paradigm that has dominated HR practice in the last, for whenever, in the health service, is particularly reliant on policies, procedures, and training. And yet the evidence, the evidence from bullying research, from whistleblowing research, from equality and discrimination research is really clear that in isolation, as Justin Eveson put it in that nice little ACAS briefing, in isolation, they will not move the dial. So what I've been arguing for, and I think it's going to be reflected in some of the stuff that NHSI may adopt, and there's a report coming out about a big fat report from me in about 3 weeks time on it, says actually we need to completely rethink the paradigm that's being used. So on recruitment and career progression, and you'll recognize some of these issues apply to bullying, for example, we need to recognize that the evidence says that training on equality, diversity, inclusion, whilst it might be necessary, is of little sustainable use. So you've got the work of Bezrakova, the stuff from Carlin and Dobbin in the States, which says diversity training is the least effective way of getting women into more senior management posts. The work by my colleague Doinetu Alagan on unconscious bias training for the HRC, it's very helpful in terms of improving cognitive understanding, very little evidence it impacts on decision making. So instead, there's a big body of evidence that says, instead of just focusing on training, we should be looking at debiasing processes rather than assuming we can somehow debias managers and they'll change their decision making, because the evidence for that is very, very thin. So the first principle is debiasing processes. I can give you some examples if that's helpful, but there's numbers of ways in which that can be done. A simple one that Google do, for example, one or two people may have a heart attack on this discussion, is don't let the future line manager be involved in the final decision about who's to be appointed. At a stroke reduces affinity bias. If you want more women and BME staff to be appointed, don't make them the only person on a shortlist, because the evidence is if there's only one woman or only one BME person on a shortlist, their chances of being appointed are much, much less than if there are two or three. And the second strand is accountability. And by that, I don't mean beating people up, but I do mean holding individuals to account, holding panels to account, holding senior leaders to account by a variety of nudges at one extreme to KPIs at another. We have KPIs and all sorts of things. And the combination of, so a simple example, a number of trusts now, led originally by the Royal Free, have adopted something I suggested to, kept repeating until I was sick and tired of saying it. Why don't you do what some organizations, including parts of the American Army, do? When a panel, you don't tell a panel who to appoint, but you do say to a panel, the likelihood over time of men and women, black and white people who've been shortlisted being appointed should be about the same. If it's not, and you have women and BME staff who are shortlisted, I need to know why, the HR director, I need to know why you appointed the person you appointed, who's a white man. And I need to know what you're putting in place to ensure those other colleagues have a better opportunity next time. That changes decision making. It shines a spotlight. It's a quite reasonable way of holding people to account. Similarly, numbers of city firms now use an approach, some of them call it comply or explain. I think people have heart attacks when I use that phrase. But what it means is, same principle. If in children's nursing, you keep appointing white women and BME colleagues just don't get appointed, there might be really good reasons for that. But you need to talk us through that, because there probably aren't. And we will help you to change whatever bits of the process are getting in the way with evidenced interventions. And overall, I would say this, it is quite remarkable if the research is right, and I think it is, that kind of approach, debiasing processes, accountability, leaders who are committed to the approach, is what the research is saying. Why is it that boards have not said to HR directors, putting forward proposals around equality, for example. Can you talk us through why you think that is the best possible approach? What do you think is the likelihood of that succeeding? Where's the evidence for it? Because when I've done that with action plans, it's been a really embarrassing silence, but we're doing it because they are. So I think asking that question and linking it to what does the research say, and then in a granular way, apply it in different ways, much of which are supportive, but some of which will eventually say, this is what we're going to do, this is what you're going to do. And particularly not forgetting the sort of frontline managers. That approach is much more likely to work than what we're doing at the moment, which is relying on individual members of staff to raise concerns rather than the organisation proactively and preventatively challenging patterns of disproportionate treatment, because that doesn't work. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, but
it's fascinating. It's fascinating, and it reflects this whole the whole problem in relation to where you rely on individuals who are often the weakest or most vulnerable individuals to raise issues, and in the face of a large and quite powerful organisation, then inevitably a lot of those individuals will simply not speak up. You know, no matter how good the channels of communication are. And I know, you know, obviously a lot of work's been done in that in the NHS with freedom to speak up guardians, for example.
I think it's sometimes even worse than that. Those who raise concern, I mean, for example, who's ever heard of somebody who challenged a job appointment, was successful in getting the job that they challenged, and then had a smooth future career? Doesn't happen.
Yeah.
In fact, they're likely to be labelled as troublemaker.
In terms, you talked about sort of process and procedure and sort of that traditional model. And one of the things I've been really struck by during this series and during various other events that I've been involved in the with NHS practitioners and outside the NHS as well, has been, at least at a rhetorical level, people thinking, oh, well, do we need to move away from process? Do we need to sort of rip up process and procedures, the bonfire procedure? And from your answer, and maybe I've got this wrong, so I just want to put this to you. From what you were saying before, Roger, it's a question about not necessarily burning up, you know, having a bonfire of procedures, but just having slightly smarter processes, which are well evidenced and that and that have clear objectives. It's not. Is it about getting rid of our process and procedures altogether? Is it about just making sure that they're a bit smarter and that there's more accountability for those people who operate them?
I think it's about making them quite a lot smarter, but I think it also varies. It's horses for courses. So on discipline, for example, I'm a great fan of the stuff that Amanda, who I know you're interviewing later, Amanda Oates has done in Mercy Care. On discipline, it's the insertion of an accountability nudge, an early informal red light that says, before you can even proceed to an investigation, you need to spell out why that's the appropriate response to what has happened. Just because somebody started coming in late, just because somebody lost their temper on one occasion at work, just because somebody made a mistake, doesn't necessarily mean that a disciplinary investigation is the appropriate response. It almost certainly actually isn't. Because once you start investigating, the focus becomes on who did it, blame, rather than learning. Mercy Care's demonstrated that, but if you look at the NHS generally, lots of trusts. It started, I think, with Barts and the Royal Free. And I just, you write these blogs and you never know how they land. But one of the things I suggested was that you move towards a patient safety approach, a learning approach, and you insert an accountability nudge of saying, stop before you go any further. And what started off in a small number of trusts is now very widespread in the NHS. I didn't know Amanda at the time. I think she took a slightly more sophisticated approach than I had. But actually, what I was saying and what she was saying were quite similar, albeit from slightly different evidential basis. And it works. So disciplinary action in the NHS, I'm not sure if people realise, there are 28% less cases in 2020 than there were in 2017, and the relative likelihood of black and white staff entering the disciplinary process has been more than halved, the gap between them. So that was a pretty simple accountability nudge, but I'm not saying you get rid of all policies and procedures. I mean, Amanda might. I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but I think it's a case of saying we need to be much smarter, as you said. But it is horses for courses. I think with recruitment, we do need processes, but they've got to be a lot better than what they are now. In fact, informality in recruitment is a byword for discretionary discrimination.
And if I can just expand that discussion a little bit to the role of HR, and I know that we'll have a lot of HR colleagues on this call, and it's something we've discussed in previous events. Where do you think that stands at the moment in the NHS? Because if you take sort of Amanda Oates and her colleagues at Merseycare, that's a great example of senior HR practitioners and HR function really driving some very positive change and changing quite radically how that organisation was dealing with, really challenging the existing paradigm, if you like, how those issues tend to be dealt with. Where do you think things stand in terms of the role of the HR function in the NHS at the moment?
Well, if we went back 20 years, I was at the, I'm quite old, Richard. I was at the launch by Hugh Taylor and Alan Milburn of what I think was the first ever HR strategic framework for the NHS. Must be 20 years ago now. And the idea then was that HR would play a strategic function and would be a crucial key person on the board, because people were going to be, it was one of the follow-ups from Francis, actually. Actually, most HR people are drowning in transactional work. We stagger from one workforce crisis, COVID crisis, whatever. So it's really hard for people to step back. I think it's not always the case. The HR director is a member of the board. So I think there's been some real issues there. Put that together with the wrong paradigm that people have been used to using. I think they are some of the explanations of why we are where we are. Having said that, I think the HR community is moving. I see some real signs of people being much more prepared to be innovative. I think there's a recognition that some of the approaches that have been used that I've described are not doing what they want them to do, your work included. And certainly, so the report I've done, which is basically, it's a review of what the literature evidence on good practice on career progression and recruitment is. When we tested that out with HR directors, it was a problem saying you can't start using it yet, rather than people saying, bloody hell, what's this about? So I think people are, lots of HR people are really up for innovation. I would say, though, that within HR itself, there are some tensions. I was on the panel that oversaw the piece of work done by the HPA in London with Black and minority ethnic HR colleagues. And what came out of that suggested there are problems within the HR community about how staff are managed, how they're developed, how they're treated, and so on. So I think the HR community, I see it's moving forward, but it has to address those sorts of issues in the way that the London HPAMA are trying to do.
Okay, and one of the things that you mentioned earlier as well, which I'd just like to pick up on, we're getting loads of questions, so I might move quite quickly to some of those so we can, involve people. No, they're generally pretty positive at the moment anyway. You talked about training and sort of like the potential problems and the evidence of the lack of the lack of impact of training, particularly in certain areas. Are there any areas where you think actually that managers, HR, etc., need more upskilling, need more skills within the NHS, or is it just that training as a whole doesn't work, or are we just developing training in the wrong sort of areas?
Well, I think what we've done is we've made training in terms of processes. We've assumed it can do much more than it can. I'm actually a big fan of training on some issues. So, for example, in career development, career progression and recruitment, unless those who lead the work have an understanding of biases, stereotypes, assumptions and behaviors that undermine fair processes, having better processes won't necessarily make much difference at all. So you need those better, you need the debiasing of processes, but you also need people to understand the really subtle ways in which we make assumptions about people, in which our brain, kind of system one, system two thinking, we make decisions and we operationalize prejudices we don't even realize we have. So you need both. It's really important people have some understanding of biases, stereotypes, etc., assumptions. Similarly with bullying, it's really important that people understand both the impact of bullying and have some understanding of what sorts of things might work better. So I don't want to come across as a Philistine against training. I think that the most training, however, in the NHS has not been effective. I think people know that. The online EDI training, for example, just scrap it. It's a complete waste of time. But face-to-face training around those sorts of issues, biases and so on, can be very effective and very important, as long as you realise it doesn't on its own change your decision making.
So just on that, so there is a question here from Wyn Jones. If EDI training is not effective, what's the role of the NHS Leadership Academy and Health Education England in terms of supporting the EDI agenda, which is very relevant to what you've just been saying?
Well, I think they have got a role, but I think it's it's less focused on, in the narrow sense, this is how you do, this is how you operationalize our current processes and try to make them fair. And it's more about understanding the things I just talked about: biases, prejudices, stereotypes, assumptions about things like merit. Assumptions about merit are so flawed. Merit's defined by those who've been successful as a result of the current definitions, that inevitably leads people into all sorts of cul-de-sacs. So I think there is a big role. I think the second thing for organisations like Leadership Academy is it's not just the content of the training, it's the way in which it's then consolidated by people at work having opportunities to the stretch assignments, which research suggests are the key things. So it's not going on courses that on its own makes you a good leader. It's the opportunity to test out, to learn, to showcase, to develop through acting up, secondments, being involved in projects. So it's about who gets on the courses, it's the content of the courses, but particularly it's about when you come back off those courses, do you get the opportunity to build on it? Because if you don't, and disproportionately Black and minority ethnic staff don't, it's almost a waste of time going. So I wouldn't be too hard on the Leadership Academy itself. I think they, I think the key thing is, what are they training, and is it consolidated? Why isn't there a protocol with trusts that says if we send people on these courses for £20,000 a shot or whatever it is, we guarantee that when they return to work, we will do the following. Seems obvious, but it doesn't happen.
Yeah,
in most places. I
think I've been talking to a lot of managers in the NHS over the last few weeks. And one of the things that they say time and time again, when I say, what are the barriers in terms of resolving conflicts, having good quality conversations with your staff? And it's time, and it's having that degree of space, and that inevitably needs organisational commitment and support. But I guess also we could look at central government. If I could just move on to another question here. So it reflects back to the point you were making about some sort of practical measures that could be taken to improve recruitment processes. And Tosk has asked, so if the line manager is taken out of that recruitment process, as you were sort of potentially proposing, Roger, what can be put in place to protect an individual who is appointed against that line manager then treating them unfairly because they're unhappy about the person who's been given that role?
well, that's I mean, that happens. So you have to do a kind of a risk benefit analysis, and there's surprisingly little research. In fact, I'm not aware of any research in the NHS that shows that when you take the line manager off the panel, it leads to a more diverse income. But I know of lots of examples, including some data sets, that demonstrate absolutely that is what happens now. So I'm not necessarily arguing that that's a kind of a must do. That's something that for people to think about. But there are trusts who have started to do that. In fact, there are some trusts, for example, with bulk recruitment and nursing, where that often happens anyway. And there's some really, I can't say the trust, but there's one particular trust where they removed the line managers from the bulk recruitment of nursing. So you were recruited as a nurse and then you're allocated. And it transformed the ethnicity of those who were recruited. I was talking to a very senior person in a big trust on Monday. Exactly the same thing happened. So I think there's always going to be a risk if you don't allow people to recruit in their own ilk or recruit their mates. That's a risk. It's up to the wider organisation to make it clear that's not going to happen. And I don't pretend that it's not a risk, but between that risk and the other one, I'm clear which is the greater risk.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, again, a lot of the line managers I would talk to, many of them would be delighted to not have to have something taken off their plates rather than yet something else put on it. And I'd just like to follow that up to pursue that a little bit in terms of the role of line managers. So again, when I did some research about the impact of the first wave of COVID, and I was quite surprised by this, when I asked from a sort of an employment relations HR point of view, what was the main priority? And we asked that in surveys, we asked that in interviews. And the overwhelming response was to develop line managerial skills. And so I just wonder what your reaction was to that. And I know it's a big issue across industry generally in terms of developing the skills of line managers. That is a big problem. But again, the NHS has invested an awful lot of money in training and development, etc. I just wondered, you know, what's your reaction to that? Do you think that is still a problem?
I think it's a big issue. So again, yeah, there's still the tendency for the centre to tell trusts what they should do, and for trusts to think, not all trusts by any means, that I'll give you an example, discipline. I met the board of one organisation. This was before it had been tested anywhere else. Suggested to them they insert an accountability nudge around discipline. It was a passing remark in the course of a bigger discussion. I met the chair, who's actually a very good chair, a year later, who said, "Oh," she said, "we tried that thing and it didn't work." I said, "Oh, what did you do?" Well, she said, "I told the HR director," it was an interim HR director. "I told the interim HR director and she told the managers what they had to do." I said, "Well, that was never going to work, was it?" You have to engage with them. You have to explain it's not an attempt to undermine their position. You have to accept that it can be seen as undermining their authority. They need support and some training on how to do this, how to move towards a more informal basis, how to build the trust, how to avoid the protective hesitancy, which means that some white managers are really nervous about having direct, honest conversations with some black staff. You see some of the same between women and some male managers and some female staff, and you certainly see it between some managers and disabled staff. So support and training and some role modeling around those things. You have to put those in place as well. And let's have some training around not just rational intelligence, but Unwin's kind of relational intelligence. How do you get the best out of people? Well, in every organization there'll be some teams that are much better than others. I never understood why organizations don't say, let's go and have a look at Richard's team. What is it about that team that seems to work that we haven't cracked? We're really bad at doing that. So the first frontline managers are the meat in the sandwich, and we have to recognise there's a lovely piece of work by Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Carla. It's called Rage Against the Iron Cage, which talks about if you want to deliver on EDI, you have to find a way of bringing the middle managers with you, otherwise it will crash and burn.
And I'd just like to ask you one more thing, and then I'm going to open it up for comments to the audience. We've got loads of comments in the chat, which I can't really quite keep up with, I'm afraid. I'd like to one last thing from me, and that is, and you sort of referred to it a little bit earlier about the ability to sort of share good practice. One of the things that I've noticed, and I've always found it slightly frustrating, if I'm honest, is I've done lots of research focusing on NHS organisations who do really innovative things. And I've never quite understood why you might have a trust who is doing something really, really positive with great results and have gone from, you know, being bottom of the league in terms of levels of bullying and harassment to one of the best trusts in the country. And you can go 20 miles down the road and what they do is not being replicated. In fact, there's a multifarious range of different initiatives. And there seems to be sometimes more competition than collaboration. I just wondered what and I'm an outsider from the NHS, so that might be completely unfair. I wondered what your perception of that was.
I don't think, well, there's certainly an issue that we're really poor at sharing good practice and really poor at learning from poor practice or things that didn't work, which are probably just as important. I'll word what I'm going to say now carefully. I am surprised that NHS employers don't have some kind of slightly evaluated repository of good practice around all these issues. And I think that's an issue that NHSI are keen to redress. It is quite, and when I was the co-director of the Workforce Race Equality Standard, before I left, one of the things I wanted to do is to establish such a thing, because on a lot of these issues, you have good, well-intentioned people at trust level who want to do stuff, and it's completely accidental whether they find examples of good practice. There's no system of knowing whether what appears to have worked has worked. I mean, some of the examples, I'll be careful what I say here. There are examples of all sorts of things on various websites, most notably the NHS employers one. But actually, when you look at the specifics and you know them, many of the examples given are frankly not very good ones. And producing reports which list stuff from outside the health service, if you're not careful, you just end up with a pick and mix. Well, we'll have one of those and one of those without any sort of methodological underpinning, which enables you to say, we think this is going to work because, rather than last year it did X. Well, it might do X. Different ecology, different place. I don't think it's so much competition. I think it's that there's never been any on HR issues. There's lots of stuff happens within the regional HR networks of sharing stuff, but actually it's not possible to know how well evaluated they are. It seems to be its absolute top priority, and I think I have some confidence that's going to be addressed in the relatively near future.